Hey everybody, this is Larry Roth, and I am on the Rothline channel on YouTube Live. I'm giving this YouTube Live a try to see what it's like. First things first, Rothline channel. I've mostly been posting stories about Bigfoot stories. So I want to say thank you to my nearly 500 subscribers that have been subscribing to listen to Bigfoot stories. Here recently, I've taken a turn and I've started making more videos about the Hex House of Tulsa. But I do want to let my subscribers know that I do plan on returning to the Bigfoot stories, and I actually have a collection of Bigfoot stories from Arkansas. So I'm going to start working on those items or those stories and get those posted. But for right now, what I'm doing is I'm working on a story about the Hex House of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a breaking news story in March of 1944 about a lady named Carolann Smith who kept two ladies as prisoners and slaves in the basement of her home for seven to 8 years. So I've been working on that story. I've actually become somewhat interested and obsessed with it. I was able to go to the Tulsa City County Library to their archives selection or archives area, and they have a vertical file on the Tulsa Hex House. And I was allowed to make some copies of the information, and I've actually been slowly piecing all this information together. Um, and basically transcribing these stories. Most of them come from the Tulsa World. Some come from the Tulsa Tribune. I've been transcribing these and basically putting them in a more easier to read format so I could learn about the timeline and the story of Carolann Smith. So what I'm really trying to do is I have some questions about who was Carolann Smith? What was she like? What did she do? And what happened before, during, and after the events of the Hex House in 1944? So those are some of the things I'm trying to question, or trying. Those are some questions I'm trying to get answered. Also, the first video that I made, I actually got the birth name of Carolann Smith incorrect, so I may have to redo that video. I said that her birth name was Carolann Meredith Carey, and I have found out that that was not true. Her birth name was actually Opal Mary Carey, and she was born on the 18th of May, 1893, in Indianapolis, Indiana. I believe most of the other information in that video uh, was correct, but I did get her name wrong. Um, it was a later article. Well, I shouldn't use excuses, but it was a later article that I had read that said that her birth name was Carolann Meredith Carey. But I'd found an earlier article that states that her birth name was actually Opal Mary Carey. And due to the investigative assistance from my daughter Ami, we were actually able to find a census. Well, she found a census and showed it to me from 1910 that listed the names of Carolann Smith's father, mother, and her two sisters. So anyway, I'm trying to put this timeline together. It's really kind of an interesting story. The most important parts of the story actually start around 1934 and go up to 1944. In 1934, Carolann's husband, Faye H. Smith, supposedly committed suicide, and that's the second video that I have made on this story has to do with Faye H. Smith and his suicide. And then also there is, continuing on, there was a lady named Beulah Walker that was a housemaid for Carolann Smith. And on February 2nd, 1934, Beulah Walker got into an argument with Carolann Smith. And at that time, Carolann was living in the Sophian Plaza. This was before she actually moved into what was called the Hex House. So she was living in the Sophian Plaza. Beulah Walker and Carolann got into an argument and evidently caused quite a bit of a commotion. It got a lot of people's attention in the apartment complex. And then Beulah Walker ran out of the Sophian Plaza into the street and got hit by a car. And I have found, well, I should say my daughter found an article for me that actually talks about that. And according to the information that I have, let me pull this up. See, Beulah Raines. And let me take a look at this. Now, C.C. Raines was, well, he was born May 21st, 1883, and he died April 18th, 1938. He was 51 years old at the time of this accident, and he was the captain at the Tulsa Fire Department. And the information I have is that he accidentally struck Beulah Walker as she ran out into traffic. He refused to talk of the incident again after her death. In 1938, after responding to a building explosion near the Sand Springs line, C.C. Raines was cut by a piece of metal, contracted tetanus, and later died. Now, fun fact, Raines was never charged with a crime for the death of Beulah because witnesses claimed that Beulah was running frantically in and out of traffic and had run towards Raines' car when she was hit. And also, Raines tried to stop, but he was rear-ended by the car behind him, which forced his car forward, striking Beulah. And then she died a couple of days later. And some other interesting facts. Let's see. I'm sorry. I'm taking a look at. All right. Okay, so let's get back to this. John C. Evans was the chief criminal deputy at the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office who investigated the death, the suicide of Faye H. Smith. He was 52 years old at the time. John C. Evans was born on October 18th, 1882, and he died March 20th, 1940. And the notes I have on him: investigated the death of Faye H. Smith and ruled it a suicide despite lingering questions about the case. So, and it's interesting because 10 years later, in 1944, when the news breaking story occurred that Carolann was holding these two women as hostages and slaves, they reopened the case of the death of Faye H. Smith. And I'll have some more information about that in future videos. But here's a fun fact about John C. Evans. He helped federal and state law enforcement officers track and stop Charles Arthur Floyd, aka Pretty Boy Floyd. So that was an interesting fact. And there's actually more to this story. I can provide a link to that story in the video description after all this is completed. And there was an Oklahoma retired sheriff, and I believe his last name was Kelly. Probably should have written this down, but I didn't. I apologize. I'll find out what his name was. But anyway, he was a beloved sheriff, very well respected lawman who in late 1933 or early 1934 was ambushed and killed by Pretty Boy Floyd, which, of course, pissed off law enforcement in the state, and federal officers were upset. And John C. Evans was a deputy at the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office that helped state and federal law enforcement officers track down and capture, and actually they killed Pretty Boy Floyd. So interesting fact. I'll have a link for that in the video description later on. So to continue on with this story, 1934, Beulah Walker gets hit by a car and killed. Carolann had a friend, and with the information that I have, that friend's name was Wilma Zellner. Now, Wilma Zellner was 41 years old in 1934. She was a Tulsa socialite and a wife to a rich businessman, and also a friend to Carolann Smith. And Carolann spent some time at Wilma's home due to depression, nervous breakdown, due to the death of her husband, the death of Beulah Walker, a lot of, bad things going on for her in 1934. So she did spend some time at the Zellner home. I'm hoping to find out some more information about Wilma Zellner. I only found one article that actually mentions her name. Her husband's name was Mr. W.A. Zellner. The bad thing about a lot of old articles is they didn't provide first names for a lot of people. So I've tried to look up this W.A. Zellner and haven't really been able to find out anything about him. It'd be interesting to know what kind of business he was in, that type of stuff. So between 1934 and 1936, Carolann spending some time in her apartment at the Sophian Plaza. She's spending some time at her friend's house. We do know that Carolann was interested in music, and she was encouraged by her friend Wilma to become a music teacher and teach some music classes. And that's about all I know about that. I don't know if she actually pursued that or not. Now, this is a part of the story where we get into, we have, okay. Sorry. So we have Virginia Evans and Walita Horner. These were the ladies that were held hostage for nearly 8 years at the Hex House. It was in 1936 that Carolann met Virginia Virginia Evans. She called her Virginia the Lamb because Carolann considered herself, she had a hybrid religion. So she considered herself the shepherd and Virginia was the lamb, and she was going to take care of Virginia. So there's a mixture of some Christianity, witchcraft, and some other stuff in this hybrid religion that Carolann had. So in 1936, Carolann meets Virginia Evans at a Christian Science bookstore in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Virginia was recently divorced. She had been married for 6 months. She was living in an apartment in Tulsa, but was barely making ends meet. Her father, Tom Evans, owned and managed a lumber yard in Stroud. Her family was well-to-do, which means rich. I think in the 1940s, instead of saying rich, they said well-to-do. Anyway, So her family was well-to-do, but she did not want to move back home. She was married for 6 months, got a divorce, wanted to live on her own, stand on her own 2 feet, be independent, not move back home. So Carolann and Virginia meet at a Christian Science bookstore, and they become friends and start spending some time together. Um, Carolann was receiving a monthly allowance from the life insurance policy from the death of her husband. But unfortunately for her, that money was just going towards the rent of the apartment, and she didn't really have any extra money. And Carolann, one of the things that I have learned about her is she liked the rich life. She liked being a socialite. She came from a rich family. Her father was well-to-do, and Carolann even her father paid for her to attend private schools. So she had a life of luxury that she really enjoyed. And after the death of her husband, she was getting an allowance from an life insurance policy, but it was just barely paying the bills. So she had complained about this to her friend Wilma, and Wilma knew that Carolann had started this friendship with Virginia. So Wilma suggested, rent one of the rooms in your apartment to Virginia. And at that time, they called it being a roomer instead of a roommate. So Wilma suggested that Carolann use Virginia as a roomer. And so Carolann did invite Virginia to live with her. Now, things get worse for Virginia. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh about that. Things started out great. Friendship started out great. Virginia moves into the apartment. Things are going well. They're friends. They're eating dinner together. They're going out together. They're going shopping together and doing all that. That's about the time. That was in 1936. And then I believe it was in 1937 when Virginia moved into the apartment with Carolann. And then Carolann starts to become controlling. She says to Virginia, "You are my lamb, and I am your shepherd. I will care for you, and you must follow my law." So that's a bad sign right there when somebody's saying, "You must follow my law." Now, things started to get bad when Virginia had a friend from Stroud come to visit her at Carolann's apartment. So up until that point, it was Carolann and Virginia spending time together. But now Virginia has a friend come over, visit her at the apartment, at Carolann's apartment. This upsets Carolann. Carolann throws a fit. She threatens to kick Virginia out. Virginia begs to stay. And Carolann does agree to let Virginia stay, but only if she accepts her punishment. And this is where we believe that the beating started. According to some information I have, Carolann tied Virginia's hands to a chair and then whipped her with a bullwhip. So some of this stuff is probably speculation and rumors, I know. I'm trying to find out the details as best as I can and research this information as I go along. So now we're up to the point to about 1937. Virginia has moved into the apartment with Carolann. They started out as good friends. Things went downhill. Carolann became more controlling and expected Virginia to follow her as if Carolann was God herself. So, for those of you that attended my YouTube live event, I hope you enjoyed it. This is the first time I've used YouTube Live. I might do this again in the future, but I am going to have some more Bigfoot stories to post from some Bigfoot stories in Arkansas, and I'm also going to have some more stories about the Hex House. Oh, and I have some some news I wanted to share. Um, I got to talk to Gene Watson. I should get the names correct. Gene Watson, who is the owner of the Hex House haunted attraction in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I'm excited about this. I'm really hoping that I can, and he said I could. We just got to work out our schedule. Um, I'm going to interview him and some of the crew members of the Hex House and how the Hex House haunted attraction got started. I believe it started in 2008. It has become one of the biggest and best and scariest haunted house attractions in the United States. So, I mean, and it's well known in the haunted house attraction industry. So I have read some articles about it. It's very well known. People have visited it and provided YouTube videos and other information. I'll provide links to that information and also a link to the Hex House YouTube videos. So that's exciting. I'm looking forward to that. Um, and I think that's it for now. So thank you, all of you that have watched my YouTube live. Uh, have a good evening. If you're watching Paramount Plus, I think we have a new episode of Star Trek Picard to go watch. So enjoy your evening.